Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Sharron Davies. Sharron, welcome to the show.
Hello, nice to speak to you.
It's great to have you on, not least because you've got this new book out, which I want to talk to you about. It's brilliant. I highly recommend it to all listeners. It's called Unfair Play, The Battle for Women's Sports. It's full of your story, other sportswomen's stories. It's got colour. It is absolutely packed with facts, particularly on one of the big controversial questions of our age, which is the trans question. And in this instance, the question of whether trans women, i.e. biological males, should be allowed to partake in women's sport. It covers all angles and it's really digs deep into the whole issue. So I want to get into those questions with you today, but I want to kick off by asking you, what drove you into this debate? This is a rocky area for any woman to go into because, as you describe in the book, you get abuse, you get flack, you are demonized. That's what happens to women who put their heads above the parapet on this issue. What compelled you to, I guess, no pun intended, jump in at the deep end on this question?
Brendan, you hit the nail on the head when you say women, because, you know, I've got several male friends who are sportsmen and they speak and have the same opinions. And they don't get a tenth of the flack, you know, or the abuse or the cancellation that women get who speak out just to try and protect women's rights. And this is what it's all about. So historically for me, as you will say, you know, saw in the book, that I was competing during the GDR era. And the GDR era was when the German Democratic Republic, old East Germany, were filling their young girls full of testosterone, some as young as 11, and putting them through male puberty, basically. And the average improvement they could make was about 9%. Now, the least difference between female and male was 10%, which is middle distance running. That runs all the way up to weightlifting, which is 30%. And the East German girls totally dominated with this 9% advantage that they had for nearly 20 years, and nothing was done by the IOC to stop it. So there were always two victims, people like myself, friends of mine who came fourth behind three East Germans. No one's ever remembered their names, and their whole lives would have been different if they'd won gold medals as they should have done. And then, of course, these East German girls. But what it showed was that this additional testosterone made a massive difference. And at European level, they won 92% of the women's medals. I mean, they took 6 1-2-3s at the Olympic Games in the year that I was competing in 1980 when I won my medal. 6 1-2-3s. I mean, and no medals in the men's, you know, practically. So, and no one was going, well, why is this happening? This is odd. They're turning up with these, you know, very masculine shapes, very deep voices. We've never seen them before. They break a world record, they go off and we never see them again. Nothing was ever asked of this. It was just ridiculous. So the governance from the IOC was abysmal. And what I didn't want was for another same situation to happen again, because what the IOC have done is they've not looked at the science. They've been lobbied and they only listened to trans activists. They didn't talk to female athletes. They didn't talk to scientists. They didn't talk to coaches. They didn't even speak to federations. And they just made this sweeping statement that transgender women, we have to presume there's no advantage. Well, that's ridiculous because we have men and women's races because there's an advantage and we know that. So we have decades of those results. And at the moment, there's 18 peer-reviewed studies around the world that show that we can't remove male puberty advantage. We're asking female athletes to line up at all these internationals against very mediocre male athletes that have transitioned who are now beating elite female athletes. So men's sport hasn't changed. They have fair sport. Women's sport has become a place where females are disadvantaged and knowingly disadvantaged. That's the thing that's so terribly unfair. We know that that's what's happening. You know, in the case of someone like Leah Thomas, it was so very obvious that here we had a very mediocre male athlete who'd been competing until he was 22, never made the NC2As, was ranked 10,000th in the world, right? 10,000th in the world. And then went from being 10,000th to beating 3 Olympic silver medalists 1 year later, allowed to reduce his testosterone level to 10 times what I have in my system. So, you know, and that's forgetting the fact that he's already gone through male puberty and all of that strength has been laid down. He's 6'2", you know, so you can't remove that. You're not going to be able to remove the height, the hands, the lung capacity, the bone density, the muscle density. All these things are just you're not able to remove that benefit. And so that's what I'm talking about. I don't have a problem with anyone who's trans. I have immense sympathy for any parent that's got a transgender child. But I just speak for fair sport and for women's opportunities. And here's another really interesting fact. Okay, so in this country alone, we have about 1,000 women that earn their career from sport. There's just under 11,000 men that end their career from sport. In US sponsorship dollar, and we're the same here, we're very, practically no different. In US sponsorship dollar, women get 1% of the market. In airtime, we get 4% of the market. So we already have this really tiny slice of the cake, and now we're supposed to move over. It was just never fair, and it really grated with me. And I just thought, I can't live with this and not say it.
It is extraordinary, and you outline in the book very well just how extraordinary the situation is. And you mentioned Leah Thomas there. I always remember the image, the photograph I saw of Leah Thomas taking part in a women's race, which he shouldn't have been doing, and just seeing him diving off at the start of the race, just propelling so much further than the women were when they were diving into the pool, through that power that was bestowed on him through male puberty and all the transformations that take place. You mentioned there the GDR, the old East Germany. Younger listeners won't remember the GDR, but we do. And it struck me reading your book that you've been actually fighting against testosterone in women's sports for a long time in two different ways. So firstly, in your 1976 Olympics, 1980 Olympics, all the competitions you took part in the late 70s and the 80s, as you say, you were up against women who had been given synthetic testosterone, which gave them extraordinary forms of power that they wouldn't otherwise have had. And now you're arguing against the supposed right of men with real testosterone to take part in women's sports. So across the board, over the past 40 years, you have been tackling unfair play in women's sports. It's really striking that it goes on in different ways. But I wanted to, if you could just cast your mind back to the 70s and the 80s and give us a sense of what it was like. You were very young in your first Olympics and the subsequent Olympics. What was it like to be standing there as a young girl, an excellent swimmer, predicted to win medals and winning medals, up against women who had been in some ways transformed into almost men, and the mockery that they went under themselves? I mean, I remember the media discussion in the 80s was always making fun of these Eastern European manly women. What was it like to be in that situation? How did it feel?
It felt very unjust. It's outrageous for anyone to say, oh, we discovered all of this when the wall came down, because that's stupid. You know, as I was saying, they won so much. It was so obvious. They looked very masculine. They sounded very masculine. They had deep voices, Adam's apples. Some of them had very bad acne because that's what, high levels of testosterone will do. They had, the shape of male. They would arrive and we hadn't seen them before. They would disappear. A lot of that is explained in the book, when we were able to find out why certain swimmers just disappeared afterwards. And all of this was going on in plain sight and the IOC was doing nothing. So it was incredibly frustrating, and you would line up next to these athletes and you couldn't look back at their junior programs and see how they progressed or where they'd come from because it just wasn't visible. There wasn't one because they would make such massive improvements, so very quickly. And so it's the same now, it would be exactly the same feeling. What's different now is that it's worse now. A, because testosterone through puberty gives a bigger advantage, and B, because this is at every level, across every sport, across the whole world. So during the East German era, it was predominantly track and field, swimming, a little bit of rowing, gymnastics, but in a kind of different way. But those three sports in particular, they totally and utterly dominated. But they didn't start doing the European Championships or the California State Championships or, the British Championships. They weren't in any of those. So female athletes could race in fair competitions. And I remember prioritizing with my dad the Commonwealth Games because, it was going to be a really hard competition against the Australians and the Canadians, but there would be no East Germans in there, so it would be fair. So that was the way that we tried to deal with it. But now that's not the case. You will have transgender athletes in every level, every kind of competition, whether that's junior competitions, school competitions, international competitions, or masters events in particular. And so it's a worse problem, really, in lots of ways for females to be able to not enjoy fair sport and the opportunities that come from that. And you have to understand, I think, today as well, that sport isn't just something that people do at the weekend for a little bit of recreation. This is people that train 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, spend decades doing it, for that one race, that one opportunity to stand on a podium, which will launch them for the rest of their lives, which will give them a career. And that's been taken away from female athletes, that equal opportunity to that those opportunities of success in the outside world because of what they achieve in sport.
Yeah, it's staggering. And reading about your story in the book and the Moscow manipulators and what was done in the GDR, you have some excellent chapters on the history of the misuse of testosterone in women's sports in the 1980s. And it's really, really eye-opening.
And really sad too, isn't it? I'm disgusted with the IOC because all of this was going on in plain sight and they did nothing. And then many of these girls have died. Most of them have serious heart conditions. Several of them have had disabled children. This is all of a result of just literally being treated like lab rats. So they didn't just let down, clean athletes. They let these poor girls down that were just used as fodder for propaganda, during that period of time.
Yeah. And you make it very clear in the book that you see what happened with the GDR in the 80s has also been a product of misogyny. So you had these men who were running society who were pushing forward these young women and giving them drugs they shouldn't have been taken to do things that they shouldn't have been doing.
Well, men still run sport now, Brendan. The vast majority of sports are run by men, which is one of the biggest problems we have, why women's sport isn't being championed properly and isn't being fairly represented. Because men don't see it as a threat to them. They don't see it as a threat to men's sport. And of course it's not. Any female that's transitioning to be a trans man will never threaten elite male athletes. And in fact, the vast majority still opt to race with the women, which the women actually, by the way, have no problem with, providing they're not on testosterone. So, you can identify however you like, just race where it's, where your biology matches everybody else. And that's why it's so important to have this open category. Because again, trans men just get kicked to the side and forgotten about. Where do trans men that are on testosterone race if we don't create an open category? Because they're not legally allowed to race with the women because they're taking an illegal substance, which would ban them. So where is their home? Well, again, no one ever talks about it because, again, they don't matter because actually biologically they're female. It's disgraceful, really, the misogyny that is happening in the world of sport.
So in the 80s, there you were standing next to these women who were on synthetic forms of testosterone. You fast forward to today and we have someone like Riley Gaines, the brilliant American swimmer, who's having to stand next to Leah Thomas. And you think, what has changed? Except for the fact that, as you say, if anything, it's now worse because natural testosterone gives an extraordinary amount of power to men through the process of puberty and so on. And I wanted to talk to you about that a little bit because we often hear the argument that there's not that much difference between biological women and trans women. Actually, trans women have their testosterone tends to be lowered through the various hormonal treatments that they undergo. But you describe brilliantly in the book, there's so many excellent facts here, which I'm going to remember and arm myself with precisely for discussions in the future. You talk about the fact that women tend to be 9% shorter than men. Men have much more muscle mass than women. And there's this really interesting graph where you outline the male advantages in different sports. And it goes right from rowing, where men might have an advantage of around 10 to 12%, right through to weightlifting, baseball, hockey, where men have a huge advantage over women.
Here's a really scary one, like punching. So I'm sure you saw in the book, but a male of equal weight, so the same height, the same weight as a female, you're not talking about a great big fella versus a little woman, right? We're talking about a fella that weighs exactly the same, will punch 160% harder onto a less bone structure because females have a less dense bone structure. So, the possibilities of serious injury in contact sports are vast.
So could you just say something for our listeners about how those biological differences, physiological differences between men and women, how do they play out in sport, in a sport like swimming or a sport like cycling? How does it translate into an advantage that just makes it incredibly unfair for women who have to compete against men?
Yeah, so puberty is when the majority of, I've got a 16-year-old son that, that's full of testosterone, full of spots and grunting like crazy at the moment. Anyone that's got kids will understand that position. And I had a daughter who's 25 now, but when she was 16, she did nothing but cry all the time, so they are very different beasts. And that's because of, the hormones that are rattling around in their body. With testosterone, it enables a male to have bigger lung capacity. As you mentioned, the size of hands, the height, all of those things. So what we're comparing is the average female and the average male. We're not comparing, an elite female with the very worst male. We're taking the averages the same way we would take the elite male and the elite female and compare them. which is why we've got this 10%, 12%, all the way up to 30% in weightlifting at the Olympic Games. And those figures you can't argue with them. They're over decades of results. And that hasn't changed for years. There was a little bit of blip, surprise, surprise, during the East German period, where the women looked as if they caught up a tiny bit. That's because they were being given, synthetic testosterone. But that now has dropped back. So we have got this very consistent difference between male and female performance. Things like Q angle. So females have bigger hips because we're giving birth. So therefore, the angle between our hips and our knees are considerably wider, which means that women footballers get 6 times as many knee injuries. And we know that from statistics, but we also know that because half of the English team at the moment are out with ACL problems. So those are things that make a big difference when you are striding on a track. It means that you can put more power directly through. On a bike, it makes quite a big difference. None of these things can be removed by suppressing testosterone. And even those people that have suppressed testosterone for a really long time, we had a study that came out of Brazil in September of last year, and that was showing that even after 14 years, there was nowhere near parity between male and females, of suppressing testosterone for 14 years.
So I wanted to ask you about the suppression of testosterone, because this is the argument you hear most from those who are in favour of trans women competing in women's sports. They will say, well, look, these trans women, biological males, have undergone hormonal intervention, sometimes surgery.
Very rarely surgery. Not a single one I can think of in sport.
It's much less common now for surgery to take place. But they will argue that going through this process, their testosterone is hugely reduced in comparison to when they were presenting as men, and in comparison to men in general. And I've never found that convincing, firstly, because one of the things that testosterone does when it courses through your body during puberty, if you're a boy, is it changes things in a radical way. You get more muscle, you get larger, you get bigger, you get stronger, and those things can't be reversed unless we're going to start shrinking people and making them thinner. It doesn't add up. So could you just outline for us why the testosterone suppressing argument doesn't work for you? So you don't accept the idea that just because a trans woman, a biological male, has taken steps to suppress their testosterone, that makes them equal to women on the sports field.
Yeah, so I like to use stats and actual facts. So here's another really interesting fact. Apart from, I think it is the 800 meters freestyle in the swimming pool, 14-year-old boys in America can beat every single one of the American nationals for women. Now, bearing in mind how strong American swimmers are, they were probably the strongest swimming nation in the world. So 14-year-old American boys are all faster than the fastest American females. So that's what happens at puberty. And that is all laid down, as you say, because of hormones, this massive surge of hormones. And in fact, we have surges of hormones even when babies are first born. So that hormone works in boys even from really early doors. This isn't just, at puberty. In fact, we can see the difference in performance at 8. Throwing in particular, things like that, upper body strength is much more developed in males than in females. And so by suppressing testosterone, you're never going to remove all of that stuff that happened during puberty. And if you carry on training, so let's just say you blow a ball up, and then that's the size of the ball, and then you stop blowing the ball up, the ball's going to stay that size, isn't it? And that's basically what you're doing. And if someone carries on training, even if they reduce testosterone, you're not going to lose that, an awful lot of that strength and that power. And that's what the East Germans are doing. So again, it's back to me being able to know the science and know what happened during that East German period, where they gave these German girls all these drugs off season whilst they were training behind the Iron Curtain, and then reduced them so that they were clean whenever they came out to race. Because they were tested the same as I was tested, at the Olympics. And it didn't show up because they worked out they could remove testosterone in 3 days.
One of the things I find very frustrating in this discussion, when I follow the arguments you've been making and the speeches and articles that you've been producing over the past few years, and others as well in relation to women's sports and the importance of defending it, you will often be accused of being discriminatory towards trans women. The headline is usually, you want to ban trans women from sport.
And I so don't. I want everyone to be involved in sport. And GMB did it this morning, and it's disgraceful because it's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying there must be a place for everybody in sport, but it must be fair.
Yeah. And I want to ask you about that open category idea in a moment. But there's this really important part early on in the book where you have this line that I just thought that makes perfect sense to me, where you say, the exclusive nature of sport is the very thing that makes it inclusive to a wide range of people across society. And what you mean by that is, and you give the example of 15-year-olds are not allowed to play in the under-10s because that would be unfair to young children. They wouldn't have a fair competitive interaction. You talk about able-bodied athletes don't take up part in the Paralympics. That would be unfair on disabled athletes. Most people recognize that instinctively. They know that it would be unfair to allow a 25-year-old man to play on an under-14s boys football team. It wouldn't work for either side. Why can they not see that when it comes to the question of allowing biological males to get into all the sport?
Because we've allowed this emotion, to take over, and we've allowed an awful lot of the mainstream media to be able to use these emotive words, and we've allowed them to lie continually without anyone ever really calling them out and saying that's not true. We're not banning anybody. We're trying to create categories that people will fit into that are fair, and it has to be based on science and reality, and not based on a feeling, because you can't run a race on a feeling. How do we quantify a feeling? How do we decide that person's feeling is real and that person's feeling is not real? It's absolutely crazy. And you're right. We have age groups, we have Paralympic categories, we have weight categories in things like boxing. And we have the biggest difference is sex categories. So all of those other things, age group, Paralympic sport, weight, that also comes under the category of male and female. So we have, a female bantamweight in boxing, or we have a female under 10 race, And I worry terribly about schools and primary schools. And I had parents on the phone to me in tears saying their little girl has just come back from sports day. And because the school wanted to be PC, they ran all races together and not a single little girl won a race. So all you're teaching those 11-year-old and under girls is that they can't win anything. How's that right? How difficult is it to run a race that, is just fair and gives equality? I just find it so difficult to wrap my head around this. And one of the big problems we have with the IOC is their lack of transparency, their lack of including everybody in the debate. They allowed themselves to be lobbied. They didn't use good science at all. In fact, they didn't use any science. And they didn't even ask the female athletes. In fact, World Athletics and World Swimming and World Rowing and World Rugby were the first to ask female athletes, and it took them 7 years to do that, to ask a single solitary female athlete how they felt about it.
I mean, it's just extraordinary, really. But I did want to ask you, in fact, about sporting bodies and particularly about the IOC and just about what the current position is, because you do talk in the book about how the IOC's approach to the trans question has changed. So they used to require, I think I'm right in saying, they used to require, you had to have a surgical transition before a biological male could take part in women's sports. Now, it's my opinion that even a surgical transition doesn't turn a man into a woman.
It still would remove that puberty advantage. It would stop
Exactly.
It would stop you any benefit going forward, any improvement that you could probably make, but it wouldn't remove whatever you've built up to that point. So even a surgical transition, as far as I'm concerned, I personally would love to go back to the point where we used to do sex testing. And the trans lobby will say, well, that's so intrusive. Well, it's not. It's a cotton bud swab to the inside of your cheek because the cells will never change. So, and that's it. The whole thing takes 30 seconds, if that. And believe me, if you're an elite athlete, you've got to pee in front of somebody, right, for the rest of your life for a doping test. That's way more intrusive than a sex test. So if you have a problem with a sex test, you're not for elite sport.
So what's the current position with the IOC? What's happening there? Because you mentioned other sports bodies too in relation to rugby and cycling. And I think the way in which some of these organisations have treated women over the past few years has been just really quite repulsive, not engaging with them, not talking to them, often seeming to care more for the signalling of their own pro-trans virtue rather than really thinking about what women need in their sport. What is the current position with the IOC in relation to the trans question?
I think that's probably one of the things that's disappointed me the most. I thought we'd moved on a lot. I mean, in my Olympics in 1980, there were still 4 men to every female. Okay. At that particular time, there wasn't a single female sitting on the IOC committee. I mean, we had such terrible female representation. It's not a lot better, but it's got a little bit better. And yet people that are in those positions are not speaking up for female athletes. And I find that incredibly disappointing. They're guarding their position rather than, sticking their head above the parapet. I'm just astonished. Their job is to look after sport. And to me, I would have thought that one of the first principles of sport was fairness. And what also is so frustrating is that this would never happen to men's sport. This would never be allowed to happen to men's sport. Men would not put up with unfair sport. It just wouldn't happen. And it's as if they just don't seem to care about, women's sport and that opportunity, that equality, that right to fairness. And the IOCs are the biggest culprits because they're the ones that buckled. And then the problem was they put the pressure on everyone else to be brave enough to stand up to them, and nobody was. And it's taken all this time and all this lobbying to try and get those governing bodies to do the research, to listen to the scientists, to listen to their athletes, and then be brave enough to say, well, no, we're going to ring fence the female category, and then we're going to create an open and inclusive category so everybody has somewhere to race. And that's important. And if that doesn't work, then we need to think again. But, the answer isn't to throw women's sport under the bus. The answer is to think laterally and to engage everybody around a table from all the different groups and to say, right, let's bash out solutions.
Hello, everyone. It's Brendan here. I just wanted to let you know that my new book, A Heretic's Manifesto, is now back in stock on Amazon. Amazon UK had a bit of a glitch there for a few days, but it's fixed now. So if you tried to get a copy of my book from Amazon and you couldn't, go back there right now and you can get it. Or if you'd like a signed copy, we still have our very special offer running. Anyone who donates £50 or more to Spiked will get a free signed copy of the book while stocks last. To donate your £50 and get your signed copy, go to spiked-online.com/donate. That's spiked-online.com/donate. We'll also throw in a whole year's access to Spike supporters, our online donor community packed with perks, as an extra thank you. Thank you so much, and now on with the show.
So you mentioned earlier that we are often being told lies about how sport works, the difference between men and women, the idea that trans women are literally women. That's something that we hear all the time. That's one of the mantras of our age. Trans women are women. Anyone who doesn't say that it can find themselves in hot water. And this is why someone like Keir Starmer is always tying himself in knots, because he would rather say anything except trans women are not real women. So this is where it becomes quite thorny, isn't it? Because there is a broader social question underneath all the brilliant work that you do and lots of other women on Turf Island, as the UK is often referred to, lots of the other women do, the women behind Sex Matters, behind Let Women Speak, behind various movements that have risen up in this country, which are basically saying women deserve their own sex-based rights, their own spaces, and men should keep out. The broader question there is the question of whether trans women are women. And I did want to ask you about that, not to try and get you into trouble or anything like that.
My feeling on it is that trans women are trans women. And they deserve respect and they deserve safety. And I think it would be much better as society had that ability to respect them and give them safety as trans women rather than try to pretend that they're something they're not. And, so that's, but I loathe all the labeling. I think this is so regressive. I've spent my whole life trying to get away from the idea that run like a girl. That's so offensive to say run like a girl when someone spends 6 hours a day honing their body to be, athletic perfection. And then, someone's doing a mimic of them running with their arms flapping around. It's like, this is not what being a female is. A female is not lipstick, high heels, and a short skirt. Being female is the female biology, the hormones. It's what you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's what women have been dealing with all over the world. But do you know that more women have been killed in the last century just because they're women than men have been killed in every single war?
Yeah, that fact did leap out at me when I read it, yeah.
And, and I think it's anywhere between 2 and 3 women every single week are killed in this country. And we have one of the better statistics. Places like Mexico and Turkey, are 2 or 3 times as bad as us. Women are murdered all the time purely because they're women. So it's this constant battle to understand that we're not better or worse, we're just different. We're built to do a different job. That's why, females have large gametes and produce eggs, and males have small gametes that go swimming and produce, and actually are responsible for what the next sex is. And that's the change. That's it. That's the truth of it. There is no third sex. There's no third gamete. People with DSDs, differences of sexual development, are not to gotcha for trans activists. They're still male or female. And this is a difference of their sexual organs. This isn't because they've become hermaphrodites, which doesn't actually exist. These awful gotchas are used constantly by trans activists to try to trip people up without actually telling the truth.
Yeah. And the book is full of science and facts. It's incredibly useful on that front. I did want to ask you about whether you were surprised when this whole trans controversy blew up over the past few years, and it really impacted on women's sports in particular and led to palpable, very clear acts of unfairness and injustice against female athletes. Were you surprised by that? Because it does seem to me that we're in a bit of a contradictory moment right now. Because on the one hand, we like the girl boss. We like to celebrate women, move up into the boardroom. We want women in positions of power. Outright sexism in the old-fashioned sense, like in the 1970s stand-up show or something, is no longer acceptable. And we also celebrate women's sports too. So everyone loves the Lionesses. Everyone was cheering them on in their final. Women are doing incredibly well in darts and horse racing, which are two sports in which it doesn't really matter whether you have a biological advantage. So women are doing incredibly well there. And people are really down with that. They think that's a great thing.
Well, they're doing better. They're doing better. And we give them a bit of airtime because it's novel to see a female, with all the guys throwing a set of darts. But actually, when it comes to the big prizes and the big money, they're not. It's like if I said to you, okay, tell me how many Formula One female champions there's been. In 40 years, there's not even been one that's taken part, let alone been a champion. It's things like that. And those are supposed to be open categories. Those are categories where both males and females can rise through the ranks and both become successful. Well, it doesn't happen. Women don't get those opportunities to rise through the ranks. So the only way to do that is to have women's races so that they have somewhere they can go and shine. And then maybe if they're good enough, we can encourage them to move over and take part. But it's not happened so far.
So were you shocked by what happened over the past few years? I mean, I was being naive. Maybe you have a better understanding of the problems of misogyny, not only in relation to everyday life, but in relation to women's sports. Because I had assumed that we were moving into a new era in which, yes, women's sports doesn't get as much airtime as men's, women don't make as much money, and all those things are still true. But I thought there was a general sense that, of course, women should absolutely have the right to play sport and to excel in their sport. And yet suddenly, over the past few years, we've gone back to almost like a GDR-style situation where everyone is turning a blind eye to the fact that women's sports is really being overturned by this new ideology.
Yeah, something like cycling, there's 50 transgender women, so that's biological males in elite cycling in the USA and Canada alone. So, to say that it's one or two and it doesn't matter is absolute garbage. It's just not true, okay? I mean, things like parkrun and Strava, I don't know if you're a cyclist and use Strava, but it's what every cyclist uses so they can do course records and, plot their times and all the rest of it. Their system is that you totally and utterly self-ID. So now women are losing all of their records for parkruns and Strava by men identifying as women and just breaking them all. So it's like, what do we have? What little tiny thing do we have left? It's... And again, where would be the harm for Strava and Parkrun to create an extra category that people can just tick? I don't understand. Why would we not protect the women? Why would we not say that they can have their own records? I just find all of that kind of bizarre. And you mentioned that we're getting more publicity. Well, we get more publicity in certain sports. So we get more publicity in football, rugby, maybe a little bit of cricket. But if I asked you to name the top female swimmer, I think you'd really struggle. So would most people on the high street, whereas in my day, that wasn't the case. Swimming used to get on television 3 or 4 times a year, and we'd be able to talk about badminton players, and we'd be talking about hockey players, and, we'd be talking about women across different sports all over the place. That's not the case now. It's really hard, apart from Olympic year, to see any women doing other sports other than, maybe a few team sports. And again, even with the football, we get this massive push when the ladies are successful, and weren't they incredible? And then we practically see nothing. So, and if you look at a newspaper, there'll be 20 stories on men's sport. We'd be lucky if there'll be one on women's. And it's the same with airtime. That statistic, that 4% statistic is a good statistic. It's actually got worse since then. Those are the stats from, I think, up to 2017. But women in America, and we're exactly the same, women in America get 4% of the primetime sports airtime, 1% of the US sponsorship dollar. 1%.
That is a crazy statistic. Okay. Sharron, I want to ask you about the impact that jumping into this discussion has had on your life, because you mentioned some of these things in passing in the book, and you say you've kind of got used to them, but they are still very shocking. You mentioned when there was an event, I think it was in Cardiff, where people were gathering to talk about women's sports, women's rights, and trans activists threatened to burn the building down with everyone inside. We've all seen other instances. We saw what happened to Kelly J. Keane in New Zealand, which to me just looked like a modern day witch trial where she was attacked and pushed and screamed at by a howling, deranged mob. We know that other women get death threats, they get no platformed, they lose work, they are turned into social lepers in some situations. So could you give us a sense of what it has been like for you to take this stand in defence of women's sport?
Yeah, and you talked about Riley, Riley Gaines, who was racing Leah Thomas, and they gave the trophy to Leah when they drew. And then, Riley bravely had finished her dentistry degree and decided she was going to speak out. And most women, have been threatened into not getting jobs, not being able to pay their mortgages, not being able to finish their university degrees. So they stay quiet. Even to the point where they have a male, with full male genitalia changing in their changing rooms, and they were told that they couldn't have a problem with that. It blows my mind that they're not even allowed a voice, even a respectful voice to say, well, can we create a third changing space or something of that nature? It's, I don't know. I mean, my dad spoke out during the East German era and he was vilified for that. He was never picked as an international coach because he spoke out. And he literally said, these East Germans are cheating. I don't know how they're cheating. They're obviously taking something, but something needs to be done about it. And he was never selected. And in 1980, I was the only female British individual medalist of the whole team. And he didn't just have me as an athlete. He had another silver medalist as well. He would have been another gold medalist, was also part of his swimming squad. And that vilification for literally asking for justice then is exactly the same as now. We seem to be getting the same vilification, but just saying, well, look at the evidence, what's going on. I just couldn't sit back with any form of conscience and watch it happen over again. And I'm really lucky, Brendan. I've had 40 years of an amazing opportunities in my life. I've had, so many wonderful things that I've done. I put all my money into property and I live in my house and it's a lovely house and the mortgage is just about paid off and I've got 3 beautiful kids and I've got so many wonderful things to be thankful for that if I took a bit of a hit, then I took a bit of a hit. And my mum sadly died and she left me some money. She split it between me and my brothers and it was about 80 grand. I'm 100% open and honest about all of this. And I spent every penny just paying my bills. But I thought my mum would be really proud of me that that's what I spent her money on. Because I remember mum telling me that when she bought her first house with my dad, all of the deposit was her money that she'd been given from her dad because she was an only child. And she wasn't even allowed to be on the mortgage. And I just thought, the problem with the young generation now is they don't realise how much sacrifice past generations have made to get the equality that we've got.
Yeah.
And I do remember my mum saying how difficult it was, and I just thought we're flippantly throwing away these things that we've worked incredibly hard to get, thinking that somehow, I'm very disappointed at the number of handmaidens that seem to be appearing, and whereas I suppose I love the idea of being a strong female, having independence and having a voice. And it feels sometimes like a men's movement. The whole thing feels like a men's misogynistic movement at times.
Yeah, it definitely does. I've referred to it as misogyny in drag, where if you want to abuse a woman these days, if you want to take away a woman's rights or her space and you want to insult her and call her misogynistic names, you just need to identify as a woman and then you get away with it scot-free. That seems to be how it works. And you've talked about the fact that you've lost work. You've just given a very good case there about how you are in some ways you're in a better position than some of the women who haven't had the successes that you've had and don't have the life that you've had. And I think the chilling impact of cancel culture is often it trickles down and it sends a message to women and men at large that if they dare to speak out, they will suffer really badly. They might lose their job, they might lose their home, and they can't afford to do any of those things. But you have talked about losing work. You talk in the book about people calling you a right-wing extremist and obviously a TERF, and which basically is a modern-day way of calling a woman a witch. How do you deal with that stuff? How do you deal with the loss of work, the insults? Is it something that you're now getting used to? Is it something that you feel angry about? How does that make you feel?
I think the competitor in me comes out, as in just keep throwing them because all it does is make me more determined, and I think sometimes some of the trans activists have worked that out, that, actually they're not going to be able to abuse me into silence. So, it just makes me more determined to be able to try to push the truth out there. I have friends that have got transgender children. In fact, I was talking to a friend this morning that's got, a transgender child, and I have immense empathy, and I love her daughters. I've known her now daughters since they were little boys, and I have no problem with any of that. I'm a huge believer that we treat people on face value, and that they're Their sexuality, the colour of their skins, their religion, that's all irrelevant. It's about the person and whether they're a good or bad person. And that's all that's ever mattered to me. And I suppose I just think, well, we can't please all the people all the time. It's impossible. We live in this ridiculous world where everyone is virtual signaling 24/7, thinking that somehow everybody loves them. But actually, we seem to be living in the most hate-filled times that I've ever seen. And a lot of that is down to social media, and this bitter world that we live in where people are very jealous of what everybody else has got. And we're all living other people's lives instead of living our own lives. And that's why I love sport so much. That's why sport is so important to us. It's so important to everybody, not just elite athletes, because sport, not only physically keeps us in great shape, which is important, it keeps us mentally in great shape. And mental health at the moment, especially in young people, is dire.
So, Sharron, my final question for you. I think this book is going to make a huge impact on this discussion. It's full of facts, full of information, and full of examples of how awful it is when women are mistreated in sport and not allowed to play fairly and to compete fairly. So I think it will make an impact on that discussion. And I want to just end by asking you, what would be your ideal vision for the future? You mentioned the open category earlier, the idea that there should be an open category in which people can compete, and they won't be in the women's and they won't be in the men's. Going forward, there's the open category idea. There's the arguments that you and others are making to say, listen, let's really get out there and defend women's sports and keep it as a specific category. What's your vision like for the next few years? How would you like things to go? How do you see things going? Do you feel optimistic about how things might change?
I'm really pleased that World Aquatics have done what they've done. Obviously, World Athletics with Seb. We're hoping that World Cycling will do something fairly soon, and World Rowing have put in a sub-clause, which at the moment does protect females, but that hasn't made its way to the UK. So that's where British Rowing needs to pull their socks up and sort themselves out. British Cycling have just done that. I'm finding it very frustrating that we're kind of doing one sport at a time, and I'm frustrated that the government haven't been stronger in saying we need to protect female athletes. I would love to see the Equality Act clarified. When it was written, sex meant biological sex. So if now that's been allowed to be manipulated, then let's remove that and put it back to what it was originally meant to be, which was biological sex. If we need to clarify it so that we can protect female spaces, then let's do that. And then it will make it easier, with regards to going to the courts and things like that. And I'm not adverse to that. And I'm not adverse to taking schools to court who don't believe that girls deserve to have their own sport. But it would be good to have that protection of the word biological sex being in there, so we can't pretend that it's a grey space, which at the moment we're doing. But I think open and female is probably the most sensible way forward at the moment. And then maybe we need to, meet again. Maybe we need to have this as an ongoing, moving feast, see, what's happening. What's important is that we don't have a 20-year experiment at the cost of female athletes to find out that males are stronger than females when we know that males are stronger than females, because we have centuries of evidence to show us that.
Sharron, thank you very much.
You're welcome.